such as faith and science, philosophical theology, reflection on evil and suffering, and the cultural and social impact of Christianity. Activities organized by the Faith and Reason Institute are financially supported by the Father Robert J. Spitzer Society of Jesus Leadership Fund, which honors former Gonzaga president and co-founder of the Institute, Father Robert J. Spitzer. The Institute is deeply grateful for the support of the donors and benefactors who have contributed to this fund and to the Institute over the years. We are deeply indebted to all of them for the gifts that make events like tonight's talk possible. I would like to welcome and formally recognize several important people at this talk tonight. First, I'm grateful for the attendance of Gonzaga's new president, Dr. Katia Passerini. We're so glad you're here. The Institute is grateful for Dr. Passerini's interest in and support for activities that advance faith-reason integration like tonight's talk. Welcome, Dr. President Passerini. Second, I'd like to also formally welcome the participants in the 2025 Faith, Film, and Philosophy Seminar. In conjunction with the Faith, Film, and Philosophy 2025 public events, like the one tonight, we have a group of scholars of film, philosophy, faith, and popular culture who have gathered to critically discuss one another's work over the next 2 days. I don't think all of us are here, but some of us are here. If you're participating in the Faith, Film, Philosophy Seminar, if you would stand, if I could harass you guys just for a moment. So thanks to all of you and welcome very much. We're glad you're here. Appreciate it. Finally, of course, I want to welcome all of you, Gonzaga students, faculty, and staff, and members of the Spokane general public. The Institute is grateful for your support and attendance. If you'd like to know more about the Institute, browse to our website. It's very simple, Gonzaga Faith and Reason Institute, and you'll find us. Faith, Film, Philosophy marks its 13th year this week. The first series was in 2007. Now, if you're good at math, you realize 2007 plus 13 doesn't equal 2025. Yes, that's correct. Counting off a few years for a hiatus in the years around COVID, this is our 13th time to explore topics of faith and popular culture. Our theme this year is Psyches, Personae, and Characters, Human Selves in Film. This week we have already been addressing questions around this topic. What possibilities for examining selfhood do films offer? What films are particularly successful at revealing aspects of human psychology or psychological development? What can we learn about human selves from particular films? What films or directors develop promising analyses of human selfhood? We began on Monday night with a faculty panel exploring compelling cinematic characters. On Tuesday, a panel of students offered a set of thought-provoking studies of recent films and TV series that address the issue of selfhood. Then last night, guest speaker Joel Mayward from George Fox University intriguingly delved into the way the self is depicted in the films of Christopher Nolan, using Nolan's mind-bending thriller Memento as a point of reference. We continue after tonight with a final public talk tomorrow night by Vern Cisney from Gettysburg College, right here, who will critique the nihilism of David Fincher's film, actually David Fincher's, I want to skip this word, his gritty film, Seven. I don't want to leave that word out, so we're looking forward to hearing from Professor Cisney. Well, what about tonight? Well, we are particularly fortunate to have Dr. Tom Hibbs with us tonight to contribute to this conversation. He was a guest at the inaugural year of Faith, Film, Philosophy back in 2007. So he has been a friend of the Institute for many years now. I'm very grateful for that, Tom. Tom Hibbs, Razor Professor of Philosophy and Dean Emeritus at Baylor University, is a prolific Catholic author, speaker, philosopher, and university administrator. His research and teaching focus on moral philosophy and aesthetics. He's published 8 books, the most recent of which is Theology of Creation, Ecology, Art, and Laudato Si, published by University of Notre Dame Press in 2023, as well as many scholarly and popular articles, and he's delivered lectures across the U.S. and abroad. Hibbs was the inaugural dean of the Baylor Honors College, from 2003 to 2019, the founding director of Baylor in Washington. He was telling me a little bit about that program, 2015 to 2019. He's held administrative appointments as department chair in Boston College, dean at Baylor, and president of the University of Dallas. Hibbs directs a summer program for Baylor undergraduates in Washington. I repeated myself, sorry about that, but it engages questions about religion and social and political life. Tonight, Dr. Hibbs addresses how philosopher Charles Taylor's conception of the human self provides a lens for examining the filmmaking of Polish director Krzysztof Kieslowski, especially his Colors trilogy of films, and of that trilogy, particularly the film Blue. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Hibbs for his talk, Inescapable Moral Horizons, Kieslowski's Blue, and Charles Taylor on the Self in Moral Space. I forgot to turn the display on, sorry about that, but it's warming up. It should kick on here in a sec. So, all yours. Yes.
Okay. Really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be back. Really honored to have your new president here, and wish and pray for many blessings on the institution under your leadership. It's such a crucial role at a really wonderful institution. I'm glad to be back, and glad to be back here with the Faith and Reason Institute. Wow, I'm tucked in between two of the most physically arresting films, Memento and Seven, and I'm going to be giving you a lot of European film stuff here. So you might need to run out for coffee at various points compared to watching Seven or Memento, two of my favorite films. And I will be showing some clips. Thank you, sir, for giving us access. Toward the end of the film Red, which is the last in this Three Colors trilogy from Polish director Krzysztof Kieslowski, who lived only from 1941 to 1996. The main character, a female, Valentine, says, "I feel something important is happening around me." Many of the films by Kieslowski feature characters who realize that, as the moral philosopher Charles Taylor once put it, something incomparably important is involved in our deliberations and choices. The Three Colors trilogy debuted with the release of Blue, which is a film I'll be concentrating on tonight, in 1993. Followed months later by White and then Red, which were both released in 1994. Kieslowski's regular co-writer suggested the idea of making a trilogy inspired by the colors of the French flag, with each film exploring one of the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty in blue, equality in white, and fraternity in red. The films moved audiences from the beginning. When the 1994 Palme d'Or was announced at Cannes and Red lost to Pulp Fiction, a woman in the audience shouted, "Kieslowski, Kieslowski, Pulp Fiction is shit." I don't think that about Pulp Fiction, but it's a great statement of at least an initial reaction to the superiority that this woman thought was present in Kieslowski's films. Although Tarantino remains probably an increasingly well-known name since that time, Kieslowski, I think, is now virtually unknown outside the world of critics. In a 2018 BBC poll of critics from 43 countries, Blue was ranked among the 100 best non-English language films ever made. Kieslowski, whose early films were in the documentary mode exploring life under communism in Poland, said that he tried to avoid politics in his later work. Blue would be one of the first films in that last period of his life. But Blue, as I've already indicated, pays a great deal of attention to the European Union. In the film, we learn that Julie's husband had been commissioned to write a piece of, Julie, the main character, had been commissioned to write a piece of music for the inauguration of the European Union, to be played simultaneously by orchestras in the capital of each member nation. Poland, whose communist government collapsed in 1989, joined the EU in 2004. Kieslowski specializes in the depiction of characters who suffer a sort of dislocation, a loss of orientation, or a deprivation of identity. In the Decalogue, which was 1988 to 89, a series of 10 one-hour films produced for Polish TV, each loosely based on one of the commandments, he said he was trying to describe everyday life in a world populated by people who do not know why they are living, who suddenly realize that they're going round and round in circles, not achieving what they want. The themes of anomie, dislocation, and malaise are common enough in 20th century European film. And the life world, the world we all live in, as Husserl calls it, seems to be catching up with the insights of 20th century European artists concerning the lived experience of the lack of belonging, the absence of human connection, the shattering of human relations, and the erosion of identity and purpose with their attendant physical and mental health problems. What is unusual about at least some of Kieslowski's films, especially his late films, and his protagonists, who are almost all women in the late films, is the way they discover unanticipated depths in their experience. They develop an appreciation of the mysteries of their lives and the astonishing connection of their own lives to the lives of others. These films also invite us as viewers into the discoveries of the main characters, who reflect on the purpose of their lives and ponder the mysterious mix of chance and order that suggest some shape to their lives that they had hitherto been unaware of. To adopt a phrase from Walker Percy's first novel, The Moviegoer, Kieslowski's characters discover the possibility of the quest and escape from the malaise through the recognition that they are onto something. This is especially true of these films after Decalogue, which might be said to mark the end of the period in which Kieslowski focused on the socio-cultural entropy of Poland during and just after communism. With the release of Double Life of Veronique in 1991, a film set partly in Paris, Kieslowski's attention shifts. Throughout his own career as a philosopher, and especially with the publication of Sources of the Self, The Making of the Modern Identity, Charles Taylor has insisted that so long as it remains an abstract exercise in conceptual analysis, moral philosophy will stay embroiled in insoluble skeptical puzzles, and it will be doomed to practical irrelevance. Taylor argues persuasively that moral philosophy needs to exhibit greater openness to the rich ethical resources embedded in ordinary human experience and in the arts. Taylor's claim calls to mind a warning that Aristotle issues early in the Ethics, namely, that no student of that book can profit from it if they do not already have the starting points of moral knowledge in their souls, that is, in their habits. Since habits are not machine-like capacities, their presence would include a stock of examples and at least the beginning of a vocabulary to describe human actions, virtues, and vices. Wittgenstein's line from the Tractatus, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world," is relevant here. Especially in our time, we suffer from what Taylor calls inarticulacy about ethical matters. This is certainly true in our common culture, where we lack a rich vocabulary to even describe life's most important matters: birth and death, love and hatred, wrath and mercy, success and failure, sorrow and joy. When Taylor speaks of the ethics of inarticulacy in the opening of the book I just mentioned, Sources of the Self, he's describing the dominant ethical theories of modernity, theories that reduce morality to discrete acts, devote inordinate attention to moral dilemmas, and seek to give us quasi-scientific decision procedures to determine what we ought to do. Such theories, Taylor argues, truncate the moral life, impoverish our vocabulary, and atrophy the moral imagination. In the context of such deprivation, it seems incontrovertible to me that literature, film, and other arts could contribute to the renewal of moral philosophy by returning us to the common ground of the human condition. Kieslowski once said that his films are indeed about the big questions. What is right and wrong? What is honesty and dishonesty? But in considering such questions, he avoids pat answers or easy skepticism. A kind of rough moral realism characterizes his film. One akin to that, as I'm arguing, espoused by philosophers like Taylor, who proposes that we treat our deepest moral instincts as legitimate modes of access to ontological claims about what's true and false, good and evil. Kieslowski said that the Three Colors films are about people who have an intuition or sensibility. Notice the shift there from Decalogue with characters going in circles and then realizing they're not getting any of their desires satisfied and find no purpose. Here, we're moving to characters who have an intuition or a sensibility about their lives. In the specific political and social context of late 20th century Poland and the wider world of Europe, Kieslowski's films attempt to recover what Taylor calls the inescapable moral horizons of human action and life. Kieslowski raises all sorts of philosophical puzzles, I think, but he does so less through explicit dialogue than through complex artistry. The silent framing of what initially appear to be isolated objects, the imageless presentation of sound, the tendency toward abstraction in the use of colors and objects, and the subtle interweaving of lives and plots. His artistry suggests a corrective to the Taylor-Wittgenstein emphasis on articulation that I've already mentioned. What's missing, Kieslowski's films seem to say, is something deeper than language, something out of which language itself emerges. Perhaps it's closer to another saying of Wittgenstein, don't think but look, which one might rephrase for Kieslowski as don't think but look and hear and feel. The film Blue begins with the sound of a car engine and of tires traveling on pavement. One of the scenes, I had to pick which scenes to show. I'm not going to show this one, I'll just describe it briefly. The camera is initially underneath the car. The tight angle of vision, the emphasis on the sound of the engine and the tires, the absence of any knowledge of who is in the car or where it's headed, create in us as viewers both apprehension and a desire for more information. The camera eventually moves to the image of a child's hand holding a blue cellophane candy wrapper out of a partially open car window. Then we see the girl's face with other cars' lights reflected through the back window. The camera then returns to the undercarriage of the car where we see small amounts of fluid dripping. The camera now pans out where we see a young boy sitting on the side of the road who barely notices the passing cars. As the camera shifts back to the car, the image becomes foggy. The car leaves the road and crashes violently into a tree. The boy gets up and rushes toward the car. Then the scene goes black and the camera shifts to an entirely different scene. As we, from the perspective of a person's eyeball looking out, see a blurry image of an approaching man dressed in white. He gradually comes into focus, and we realize that the blurred vision of this man in white is that of a patient in a hospital, whom the doctor asks as he touches her cheek, "Are you able to talk?" We now see the doctor reflected in the woman's eyeball. It turns out that she, Julie, played by Juliette Binoche, is one of the occupants from the car and the only survivor, as she learns from the doctor that both her husband and daughter were killed in the crash. In the next scene, we hear the shattering of glass in that same hospital, and then see the stern face of Julie, bruised, stitched up, and in a neck brace. In an attempt at suicide, she grabs a handful of pills and stuffs them into her mouth, but is unable to swallow them. Confronted at this point by one of the attendants in the hospital, she admits that she broke the glass and apologizes, her voice and manner void of any emotion whatsoever. Unable to leave the hospital, she watches the funeral of her husband and daughter on a small portable TV screen. She appears cold and detached, As the TV coverage of the funeral of her famous composer husband continues, the camera gives us close, partial images of her face. As I've already mentioned, Kieslowski is giving us information piecemeal and slowly. We sense Julie's emptiness through mood and emotion rather than traditional narration. There's something both highly artistic about the way the camera selects isolated items and something clinical about the context and significance of the action that emerges in the opening minutes of the film. Her only expression of emotion occurs, it's very subtle, as she watches the funeral and reaches out her finger on the little portable TV to touch the spot on the TV screen where her daughter's coffin can be seen. From the TV coverage of the funeral, we learn just how famous her husband was as a composer, and that at the time of his death, he was working on this concert to honor the unification of Europe. Julie, meanwhile, cuts off everyone around her, decides to put the family home up for sale. She does, however, break off her self-imposed isolation by connecting with an old friend, Olivier, who collaborated with her husband. She calls him and asks him whether she loves him, whether he loves her, He says he fell in love with her when he first began working with her husband. She then asks, "Do you think of me?" When he confesses that he does, she invites him over to the house, thus fulfilling what must have been a deeply felt hope on his part that he had suppressed for a very long time. They make love, and the next morning, she brings coffee to him as he is awakening from sleep. And I want to play this clip. D7.
Je sais très bien ce que vous avez fait pour moi. Mais vous voyez, je suis une femme comme une autre. Je transpire, je tousse. Je décalée. Je ne vais pas vous manquer. Honnêtement, on y compte. N'oubliez pas de claquer la porte en sortant.
Julie!
Rough scene in a number of ways. Cruelty toward others and then cruelty toward self, a kind of self-laceration that she's engaging in there. What sort of liberty does Julie have? Instead of a simple celebration of liberty, this first of the Three Colors films, which is devoted to liberty, puts into question its meaning and value, its compatibility with a rich sense of identity and love. It's hard to avoid the political setting, as Adam Kirsch notes in a relatively recent piece on the trilogy in the New York Review of Books. With its European setting, the trilogy replaces the previous focus of Kieslowski on the decay and malaise of communist Eastern Europe to turn to the secular prosperity of the European Union. External freedom, Kieslowski said at one point in an interview, has been achieved, at least in the West, to a much greater extent than in the East. But this is trivial in the face of humanity's permanent and essential unfreedom. We're constantly imprisoned by our passions and feelings. It makes no difference whether you've got a passport which allows you into every country or only into one and you stay there. It's a saying as old as the world, freedom lies within. It's true. But it's even more complicated than that. Blue, featuring a character that has, as Kirsch also puts it, every kind of freedom prized in the modern West, takes us into her realm of interior freedom and investigates its qualitative dimensions. The only family member Julie has left is her mother, who suffers from Alzheimer's. When she visits her, her mother looks her in the eye and says, "They told me you died." The audience, or at least this member of the audience, immediately was led to think that the mother is talking about the car accident. Then we realize that she is confusing her daughter with her deceased sister. Her mother's dissociation and failure to recognize her both deepens Julie's own isolation and in some sense mirrors the state of her own soul. In fact, Julie is deliberately trying to bring about the sort of dissociation that afflicts her mother because of Alzheimer's. There is, I think, a deep insight here. It's very interesting that in almost all of Kieslowski's late films, there's an isolated scene of an elderly person who is deeply afflicted. In this film, there's an elderly person that Julie sees carrying a couple bottles to deposit them, and she's so hunched over that she keeps having to try to push the bottle into this repository. He's focused in remarkable ways on the afflictions of the elderly. I think the insight here has something to do with our inability, or at least something that we ought not to try to do, which is to easily divide up the autonomous from the dependent. Those capable, allegedly, of full rational freedom from those who only intermittently and dimly are capable of something approaching rationality and freedom. Julie tells her mother that she was happy before, loving and being loved by her husband and daughter. She has only one thing left now, nothing. She wants to divest herself of everything. No possessions, no memories, friends and lovers are all traps. Her trauma creates a state of deprivation and inability to connect emotionally with anyone else or even with her own feelings. She does not, except in some very brief instances, grieve at all. She seems incapable of deep, authentic mourning. Julie is, as Kieslowski notes, completely free. In a fine commentary track on the DVD version of this film, Annette Insdorf, who teaches film at Columbia, suggests that the film is an inquiry into the viability of freedom from the constituting conditions of a character's identity. To understand freedom in negative terms results in a horrifying vacancy, a problem that again brings Taylor to mind. To be free from all frameworks, Taylor says, is to be in the grips of an appalling identity crisis. There is an intimate connection between identity and a kind of orientation in moral space, a sort of anticipation of connectedness and response from the world around me and especially those close to me. Blue is, I think, a kind of thought experiment that takes such independence from all frameworks to its logical and existential extreme. This is one of the points of Kieslowski's abstract use of color and sound. Careful viewers and listeners can detect in the use of both a layer of meaning of which Julie seems sometimes unaware, sometimes partially aware. At crucial junctures, not only is the color blue prominent, but also the strains as we learn at the end of her husband's unfinished symphony. Blue shows up all over the place. Blue candy, blue wrappers, blue room, blue folder, blue pool, blue crystals. But here's an early scene that perhaps most dramatically illustrates Kieslowski's powerful and deeply mysterious use of blue and music.
Bonjour. Bonjour.
Je sais que vous n'avez pas envie de me voir. Oui. Vous me laissez entrer?
Non.
Julie, il ne s'agit pas d'une interview.
C'est pourquoi alors?
Je suis en train d'écrire un article sur votre mari. Mais il y a une chose que je ne sais pas.
Quoi?
On est le cancer pour l'unification de l'Europe.
Je sais pas.
Vous avez changé. Avant, vous n'étiez pas si désagréable.
Tu n'es pas au courant? J'ai eu un accident de voiture, j'ai perdu ma fille et mon mari.
Julie, c'est vrai que vous écriviez la musique de votre mari?
That's an astonishing scene to figure out what's going on. There's no one, she seems startled awake by the loud music, and that there's no one playing the music in her environment. It's also the music, as we'll learn later, that is from her husband's unfinished symphony, which she just denied to this woman that it exists at all. There's something very mysterious going on with music. Despite Julie's attempt to sever all connection to others and to the world around her, the music persists. One might say it invades, as Joe Kikasolo is an expert, a Baylor expert on Kieslowski puts it at one point, the music invades her emotional cocoon. As we've just seen, when Julie is asked about the score, she denies its very existence, even as she's asked about whether she was in fact a contributing author to some of her husband's famous work. It turns out that she does have what she believes is the only written score of the composition. And here is that scene.
Pas encore commencé. J'ai mis le travail de côté le jour de mon départ. Oui. Voilà, voilà. Et ensuite, je pensais qu'il fallait bien attendre une décision. C'est le café. Beaucoup de corrections. Pas plus que d'habitude.
Très beau. J'aime beaucoup ce cœur. Oui.
She's taking care of that, gotten rid of the musical score. If the music haunts her, so do persons from her past. The boy who had witnessed the accident in the opening scene, named Antoine, finds her and gives her a necklace he recovered from the crash site. It was her daughter's necklace. She tells him to keep it. He tells her that when he reached the car, her husband was still alive. Then they discussed what the husband was talking about at the moment of the crash. He was telling a joke. Julie laughs briefly at the memory of her husband's sense of humor, a sign that she is not completely disconnected. This film, especially the role of music in it, calls to mind another important theme from Taylor, the distinction that he develops between the porous and the buffered self. Porous is the term crafted to describe a characteristic of the self in the pre-modern world, whereas the modern self is buffered. Almost everyone, Taylor writes at one point, can agree that one of the big differences between us and our ancestors of 500 years ago is that they lived in a so-called enchanted world, and we do not. At the very least, we live in a much less enchanted world. We might think of this as our having lost a number of beliefs and practices, but more than that, the enchanted world was one in which these forces could cross a porous boundary and shape our lives, our psyche, and physical nature. One of the big differences between us and them is that we live with a much firmer sense of the boundary between self and others. Taylor's argument is that the modern experience of disenchantment has been less a matter of changing beliefs than a change within how our psyches interact with one another and with the world. A change, as he puts it, in how we experience the self in relation to the outside world. I would add, even in relation to the hidden or suppressed recesses of our own selves. The outside in the porous world could impinge upon and invade the psyche. The porousness of the boundary emerges here in various kinds of possession, as Taylor puts it, all the way from a full taking over of the person, as with a medium, to various kinds of domination by or partial fusion with a spirit or God. Here again, the boundary between self and other is fuzzy or porous. By contrast, the modern self has become introverted, isolated, closed off from the world. The buffered ego is now alone with itself, disengaged, withdrawn. As a bounded self, I can see the boundary as a buffer so that the things beyond it don't get to me, to use a contemporary expression. In the prosperous freedom of the modern West, the buffered self predominates. At the beginning of the film, Julie is part of that world. The trauma she suffers leads her deliberately to attempt a nearly total buffering from other persons. She will discover such a project to be both unsatisfying and impossible. The way the film suggests that she is embedded in inescapable moral horizons is principally through its music. The music of the unfinished orchestral piece is heard or played by various characters even before it is finished and played publicly at the very end. Here's another scene. Got two more scenes that I want to play. She meets Olivier in this coffee shop, or he finds her in this coffee shop, I should say.
Julie? Un café pour moi. Je vous ai cherché.
Et
Je vous ai trouvé.
personne ne sait où j'habite.
Personne. J'ai perdu quelques mois, et puis après ça a été très simple, un hasard. La fille de ma femme de ménage nous a croisés dans le quartier. Depuis 3 jours, je l'ai ici.
Vous m'espionnez?
Non. Vous me manquez. Vous êtes occupé. C'est moi que vous avez fui.
Vous entendez ce qu'il fait?
On dirait.
Ouais.
Je vous ai vu. Peut-être cela me suffira pour un petit moment. J'essaierai.
Comment vous connaissez cette musique?
J'invente toutes sortes de choses. J'aime jouer.
Once again, the music from the as yet to be performed and even completed concert is being performed by someone as a character. There's to shift to a quite different use of music in a very different film. Scorsese's classic film Taxi Driver could be about as far from this universe as anything you could imagine. But in that film, there's a soundtrack to the film. But there's a moment in the film itself in which the deranged main character, Travis Bickle, played by Robert De Niro, is alone with a young prostitute played by Jodie Foster. He puts a record on his cheap phonograph and dances with her. The record is the music from the soundtrack to the entire film. It's as if Scorsese's saying, it's all right here in this film. This is a sort of part of the film that shows you the corruption of innocence that this film is, at least in part, about. That difference between a soundtrack that we hear as audience and music that is performed or heard by characters is crucial to what Kieslowski is up to here. And that mirroring, which is going on in Taxi Driver as well, of the overall soundtrack of the film in particular performances within the film. How is it that the music of the soundtrack is the same music that her husband was composing and is also the music that is performed before it is even published by a street musician? These questions are never answered. As an enduring memory or artifact from her marriage, all connection to which she strives to sever, the music can be seen as something that stays with her, will not let her go, and that it makes it impossible for her to liberate herself in the manner she wishes. Its presence, sporadic but persistent, also has a potential positive resonance. It underscores the inescapability of human connection and the irrepressibility of the natural desire for friendship, love, and affection, for communion with others. That the title of the score focuses on unification supports this interpretation. A further and even more hopeful layer is implicit in the comment of her friend that we just saw to Julie, "The music is beautiful. One can't destroy things like that." Kieslowski's longtime collaborator, composer Preisner, took a decidedly anti-Hollywood approach when he began scoring movies. Film music, in my opinion, shouldn't be an illustration of what we can see on the screen, but should play a metaphysical role. It's a dramatic axis in the movie. The film, and I just have a few brief comments about one other film, that launches Kieslowski's final and most mature period is the one that immediately precedes Blue, The Double Life of Veronique. Set in 1968, it begins with two scenes featuring young girls, one in Poland and one in France. A Polish girl contemplates the stars. In another, a French girl ponders the first leaves of spring. The time of the action then shifts some 22 years later to 1990, with a young Polish woman named Weronika performing as a singer. Before leaving for Krakow to visit a sick aunt, she tells her father that she has a strange feeling that she is not alone in the world. During street protests in Krakow, she sees a woman, a French tourist, who could be her identical twin board a bus. Soon after, in the middle of a concert performance, she suffers cardiac arrest and dies. What follows is an exploration of double lives. The film pulls us into its art and invites us to transcend, or rather see possibilities for transcendence within ordinary life. The Washington Post's Hal Hinson, in a very nice review of this film, called it a mesmerizing poetic work that takes us completely into its world, and in doing so, leaves us with the impression that our own world, once we return to it, is far richer than we had imagined. To use Taylor's language, we could say that the film recreates the conditions of the poorest self. On the same day as Weronika's death, the French tourist named Veronica has sex with her boyfriend, but confesses immediately after to being sad and feeling as if she were grieving. She's working as a teacher and arranges for her students to witness a performance by a local puppeteer. The female puppet dances, dies, and becomes an angel. Veronica then introduces her students to a recording of music by a newly discovered 18th century composer, Van Budenmeier. This is actually a fictional composer that Kieslowski and Preisner made up. In fact, someone was doing a study of all the major European composers and called up Kieslowski to ask for references for Van Budenmeier, and he had to admit it was a fictional composer that he had made up. But this is the very music that Veronica was performing when she died. Then Veronique receives a mysterious phone call where this music is being played. The music somehow spurs in her mind an image of a girl singing and collapsing. The power with which the music ruptures the silence of the evening is every bit as important as the connections the piece signifies. The scene suggests an overlapping, an interlacing of lives, not by mere chance, but because each life touches realms that transcend and encompass other lives. The convergence of stories and the parallels in destiny is evident throughout not just that film, but the entire trilogy. Music seems to operate at a level beneath or beyond that of conscious awareness. It envelops. We cannot stand, as we can with other works of art, particularly visual works of art, stand apart from it as objective, distant, dispassionate observers. We participate in music. Its presence invites both actors and viewers to ponder its significance, and at certain points in the film, as we've seen, Julie is alone and the music can be heard. And she seems to hear it, yet no one is performing it in her midst. We can see here a twist and in some ways a reversal of Nietzsche's presentation of the relationship between music and rational discourse, between what surpasses subjective awareness and what one consciously thinks. As in Nietzsche's theory, so too in these films, music escapes rational categories, encompasses individuals, and transcends their flickering awareness. It also announces its presence in experiences that can seem shocking or even violent. Yet Kieslowski's use of music is not Dionysian in the way Nietzsche describes it. Human beings can be said to be artistic creators of music, but the music itself seems to be something in which all persons, including artists themselves, participate rather than fashion from nothing. The world that we're invited into is, again, not one of Dionysian destructive violence, but one in which the characters discover themselves as parts of larger stories. In its finale, as we shall see shortly, Blue also suggests that reconnecting to others, recovering the musical depths of our lives, leads naturally to generativity, both in the creation of beautiful art and in generosity toward others. Julie does gradually reconnect with others, 3 in particular. The first is her neighbor Lucille, an exotic dancer, who calls Julie in a moment of crisis and says to her, "Nothing matters except that I called and you came." The second person with whom she connects, or in this case reconnects, is Olivier, who has all along had another copy of the musical score for the unification of Europe. In defiance of Julie's wishes, he has revealed the existence of the unfinished score. He tells her that going public was a deliberate attempt to provoke her, the only way to force her to express her own desires, for her to say whether she wants or doesn't want the music. Then he plays the music, and for the first time, the audience knows with certainty that the bits and pieces of music that constitute the film soundtrack are indeed parts of the unfinished concerto. Then Julie asks Olivier about the picture of her husband with another woman that showed up in a collection of pictures that he had. He confirms that her husband was indeed having an affair. And thus the third person with whom Julie connects is her husband's mistress, Sandrine, whom she follows and confronts. It turns out that the woman is pregnant and will soon give birth to her husband's second child, a fact about which he had not yet been informed at the time of his own death. Julie asks Sandrine whether her husband loved her, that is Sandrine, and Sandrine reluctantly says, "Yes, he loved me." Then Sandrine asks Julie, "Will you hate me?" The end of that meeting is a beginning of a new life for Julie. I'd like to play this last section, which is the second to last section of the film, but this is the last clip I'm going to play. This is right after she leaves Sandrine, after they've had a fairly tense conversation.
Entrez, je vous en prie. Est arrivé quelque chose? Vous l'avez rencontré?
À la fois, vous vouliez à tout prix que je prenne le dossier avec les affaires de Patrice.
Je n'avais pas voulu.
J'ai pas voulu. Si je l'avais pris, ces photos étaient dans le dossier. Si j'avais pris, j'aurais su à ce moment-là. Si j'avais brûlé les papiers sans les regarder, j'aurais jamais su.
Sûrement.
Peut-être que c'est bien comme ça. Vous montrez quelque chose de ce que vous avez composé. Sur un violon.
Les altos. Et maintenant?
Attends, peut-être plus léger, sans les percussions. On retire les trompettes. Piano sul tasto. Au milieu du piano,
Une flûte.
une flûte. On reprend là.
C'est tout pour l'instant.
Et la fin,
Je sais pas.
il y avait un papier. C'est le contrepoint qui devait revenir dans le final. Il m'avait dit c'est un memento. Essayez de voir si vous pouvez le faire entrer.
Anden Bodenmeier.
Ouais. Il voulait l'évoquer à la fin du concert. Vous savez à quel point il l'aimait. Est-ce que vous êtes toujours en contact avec notre avocat?
À l'occasion?
Vous savez s'il a déjà vendu la maison?
Je sais pas. Je pense pas, il m'aurait téléphoné.
Demandez-lui de ne pas le faire.
Bien.
Si vous en sortez avec tout ça, vous me montrerez?
Je vous montrerai.
Il y avait un matelas à l'intérieur.
Oui.
Mais il n'y a plus. Monsieur Olivier est venu, puis il l'a acheté. Je pensais pas que vous en auriez encore besoin.
Non, c'est bien.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
C'est déjà venu ici?
Non, jamais.
En haut, il y a les chambres à coucher et le bureau. Je vous les montrerai tout à l'heure. Là, la cuisine. Elle a toujours été comme ça.
Tu seras un garçon ou une fille? Un garçon. Vous savez comment vous allez l'appeler? Oui. J'ai pensé qu'il devait avoir son nom et sa maison. Ici.
Vous avez encore besoin de moi?
Non, vous pouvez rentrer, merci.
Je le savais. Quoi? Patrice m'a beaucoup parlé de vous. Ah oui? Par exemple, que vous êtes bonne. Que vous êtes bonne et généreuse. Que c'est ce que vous vouliez être. Et qu'on peut toujours compter sur vous. Même moi, je peux.
C'est moi, j'ai fini. Vous pouvez venir la chercher demain matin, ou le matin, si vous avez le courage.
Non, je vais pas me coucher. Mais je viendrai pas chercher cette partition.
Quoi?
Je viendrai pas la chercher. Je vais penser toute la semaine. Cette musique peut être ma musique. Un peu lourde et maladroite peut-être, mais ma musique. Ou la vôtre, moi, je pourrais dire à tout le monde. Vous êtes toujours là?
Je suis là, oui. Vous avez raison. C'est encore moi. Je voulais vous demander, est-ce que c'est vrai que vous dormez sur le matelas où nous avons?
Oui.
Vous m'avez rien dit.
Non, je vous ai rien dit.
Est-ce que vous m'aimez toujours?
Je vous aime.
Vous êtes seul?
Bien sûr, je suis seul.
Je viens.
Okay, I'll wrap this up. A lot is going on in that scene. You did notice that he has purchased the mattress on which they had their one night consummating their love and has been sleeping on it. She also writes in at the bottom flute solo at one point, right? Connecting back to the flutist whom she heard outside the coffee shop. The number of other things that are going on here. She has a similar conversation with him that she had earlier when she invited him over and then scorned him. Here he again confesses his love for her, but she's bending to his wish that they go public, that they have composed the finished concerto together, where she didn't want to be publicly recognized. And here she goes to him rather than demanding that he come to her. The woman, quite clearly, even though you didn't see the earlier scenes, is Sandrine, the mistress who's having her husband's child, to whom she is giving the family estate. The confluence of confessions of love with two acts of generativity or generosity. The finishing of the composition of the score, artistic generativity, with a choral segment based on the Greek text of St. Paul's famous praise of love from 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And second, Julie's inexplicable act of generosity as she arranges for Sandrine to live in the formerly abandoned home, a building that will now provide shelter for her husband's mistress and their child. In the final few minutes, as the music is performed publicly, we see images of Julie's face interspersed with images of all the people who have been prominent in this film, as if her identity and theirs are at some level and to some degree fused or entwined. Then Julie, at the very end, for the first time, weeps. And eventually, a soft smile appears upon her face. Only in loving and receiving love is she able to begin to mourn. I have a longer section here, which you'll be very happy to know at this late hour. I'm not going to read, which is about interpretations of whether Kieslowski's suggesting that the EU needs to become Christian in order to survive. I don't think this is a heavily, overtly political film, and I think the point is more metaphysical and ethical, and it's put in terms of a stark either or. Either love or nothing. Either charity or nihilism. A sign that Kieslowski took these matters quite seriously can be garnered from a story he told, and I'll end just by telling this, about an encounter with a fan, someone who had seen The Double Life of Veronique. At a meeting just outside Paris, a 15-year-old girl came up to me and said she'd seen the film. She'd gone once, twice, 3 times, and only wanted to say one thing really, that she realized there is such a thing as a soul. She hadn't known that before, but now she knew that the soul does exist. Kieslowski goes on to comment, there's something very beautiful in that. It was worth sacrificing all that money, energy, time, patience, torturing yourself, killing yourself, taking thousands of decisions so that that one girl in Paris should realize that there is such a thing as a soul. It's all worth it. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
Take some questions.
Yield those. Done?
Want to make sure we log you out before.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is great. One thing that, just like a scene from the movie that I was like I enjoyed, but I didn't understand why I was doing. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on like when they do like the cuts to just a black screen and then immediately go back into the scene before. What's going on there? Why can't you just do that?
What are you asking about? The role of the black screen cuts? Yeah. That happens in a couple of the scenes that I showed. The one where she's startled awake, it seems, by the music that's not being played in her presence. And then she hears the voice of the woman who's writing the article. And the music and the blue still stay for a moment. And then it's as if to have this conversation, she has to come completely out of the reverie of the music. And so it goes to black very briefly, and then it shifts. Very often that's what's going on, is that there is a radical shift in perspective or mood that is introduced by the black. It's also it also seems to me that it is Kieslowski sort of mirroring her own brokenness. I'm thinking of Memento in a really weird way, right? That I have a condition where my short-term memory drops out and I start from scratch. She's attempting to reduce her own life to a set of fragments and deliberately refusing to allow them, trying to refuse to allow them to make connections. And the film does that in the way it's structured. It's interesting that these last couple long segments don't have that. You sort of run straight through. Yes?
If I may, with the cuts to black and the music coming in, each time, at least in my recollection, that happens in the film, it's when she's meeting with somebody, and it's sort of like the rest of the world, the rest of her connections are trying to come back into her life. At that moment, the music comes in, and this fade to black felt to me like her sort of trying to force everything out again and maintain her isolation. Like when the boy who recovered the necklace comes to her, the same thing happens. When Olivier tries to reconnect with her after he's found her again, the same thing happens. So it's like this transcendent connection represented by the music is reappearing in her life and she's forcing it out.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. It is also the case, really importantly, that these reconnections, the three that I talked about, are all initiated by others, right? And we hear that Olivier has, Antoine's trying to find her to give back the bracelet. Lucille reaches out to her in a time of need. And then Olivier blatantly says, I've been searching for you, right? So one of the lessons there, I think, is to, if you're blessed enough, particularly if you've rebuffed people and cut them off, if you're blessed enough to have them still pursue you with affection, you just have to let them be there, be present, right? And as soon as she starts to do that, things start to change. I do think also, I didn't show it, but right before this long scene that I showed is her confrontation with Sandrine. And it's as if she's in part coming to terms. So she doesn't want to go back to the past, but she wants to keep that image of a perfect marriage and family intact. And it's as if she has to confront in this conversation where she learns from Sandrine and accepts it that her husband really loved the mistress more. And in a way, coming face to face with that, in a sense, frees her from a false image of the past, and somehow that's connected with freeing her up to live again in the present. She's also no longer there blaming the mistress, right? And that opens up this astonishing act of generosity on her part, really astonishing. And the action there is mirroring the litany in praise of love from 1 Corinthians. It's really beautiful in a very quiet way. Yeah.
So I noticed that Julie is always swimming. And,
In a dark blue pool. Yeah.
And the lanes go one way, she swims across them all the time.
Yeah.
I guess that's an imitation of a musical notation, perhaps.
Yeah.
Something like that. But do you have any thought?
And also her attempt to go against the natural grain of her own deepest human desires. It's also this kind of immersion in water, right, which seems to provide a sort of solace for her, a kind of immersion that allows her momentarily to forget, it seems. But it also mirrors the way the narrative works with her gradual recognition, although she never really consciously articulates this in the way a film critic might, that she's immersed in these deep connections with the world and with others that she's not acknowledging. And I think the swimming pool is, in a way, even though she's swimming against the natural flow of the pool, she's immersed in something larger than her that insofar as she's swimming, she can't escape from. And that's the life she's living at. That's the metaphysics of her life, as Kieslowski lays it out. And thankfully, she comes to some extent to accept that, and then is capable of this kind of generativity that's both artistic and moral.
I don't know the producer's movies that well, but do you think there could be baptismal allusions?
Yeah, sure, that too. Yeah. Yeah. And there's one character asks her if she's crying, right? And she says, no, it's just the water. Right? I don't think we're supposed to think that she's crying there, but it would be a way of masking mourning, right, as well. Yes.
Really appreciated this very much. So I wanted to ask about one of the final comments you made. It's nihilism or love. There is no other choice. And I wonder if that's connected to like this, if the nihilism is connected to sort of like this sort of radical interiority of the buffered self that keeps us separated from others? And then I also wanted to ask, you were making this distinction early on about Kieslowski's, earlier films about the, fall or, life under communism and the latter days of, communist Poland. And then, the sort of the sense of freedom in the West or something like that. And it also strikes me, this is French, and it strikes me that that Descartes, Descartes seems to me to play a sort of role of a culprit here, because Descartes is the figure who sort of separates us from, the external world, and then, you find that, following up in Leibniz and Kant, Fichte. So I just wonder, how do we get out of that? Does Taylor speak to that at all in this notion of the sources of the self? And I realize that that's a lot of incoherent questions I just asked.
Yeah, well, they're connected, because the first question is about the buffered self.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I cut out some of the philosophy because I feel like it starts to drown the details of the narrative if you bring too much philosophy into it. I do think this is a film that is presenting selves, and I think Double Life does this as well, as always participating in horizons of meaning that are deeper and broader than what they're consciously aware of. And I think that's important for Taylor. I think that's important. I mean, I mentioned this in passing. It does seem to me that there is a flattening of our experience in advanced Western society. It's partly through screens and so forth. There are a lot of contributing factors, but the way in which our souls can be sapped of the capacity for wonder and the deadening of our kind of awareness of mystery. I do feel like that 15-year-old girl who saw the film 3 or 4 times, that when I spend a lot of time with this and I think about my relationships to family members and friends, just as you do every day, that I have this heightened awareness of the possibilities, the dangers, the good things that are going on. I think it can induce in you, watching his films repeatedly, a greater attunement to the fact that something that we would acknowledge if we were asked, are our lives connected? Does it matter how we treat people? But there's a difference between rationally saying that and sort of having an attunement in the depths of your soul to the significance of your relationships. That, as I love that line from Percy, that to be on a quest, to discover the quest is to be on to something. The sense that there's a kind of mystery in our midst. And that happens largely through how initially we allow ourselves to be affected by others and by events. Are we it's Henry James who said, try to be the sort of person on whom nothing is lost. Right? Be the person who, no matter what you're doing, you're aware that there are degrees and levels of significance here that are not being consciously articulated. That is, in a way, to be more like a porous self, right? Well, I think, these are too broad, and the ancients were all porous and the moderns are all buffered. There's something a little bit right about that, but the very fact that we can read Taylor and acknowledge that, and that we can experience some of this through films like that Kieslowski gives us, indicates that we're not as buffered. We're not doing as good a job as Taylor thinks modern individuals are doing at achieving the state of being buffered. Yeah.
Actually, that's what I wanted to ask about it. That I wonder if, in the way you've described it, it seems that the film is a critique of Taylor's notion of the buffered self. And the reason I suggest this is Because you were talking a moment ago about being the kind of person who's open to enchantment. But isn't the point that the film depicts Julie as completely closed off? And she tries to, like you said, she
Right.
tries to engage in what we could describe as a radical buffering project. And yet what happens is enchantment wells up, right? And so it seems like Kieslowski is suggesting that the description of the modern self as buffered is, in an important sense, it's a lie, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a much more hopeful view of the modern self here. I mean, the really early films that he wrote are very dark and despairing. It's also the case that if you say love or nothing, charity or nihilism, nihilism is not. I mean, we don't need the dude from The Big Lebowski, but he helps on this, right? Nihilism is not actually livable, and so you can approach it asymptotically and get closer and closer to nihilism. But insofar as you're still living as a human being, there's a connectedness to some degree of intelligibility, some degree of meaning, some degree of purpose. And as long as that's there, there's the possibility of a great deal more. And I think that's the thing I didn't have time to talk about when I laid out the stark contrast. Is it seems to me what's hopeful about that is that she can't live it out, and none of us can. The question is whether we have others around us and opportunities and a capacity to see what that means. She seems to see very quickly that this means finishing the concerto, that this means this great act of generosity towards Sandrine, right? It's as if something happens in her soul when she realizes that that the life that she thought she lost was not real. That was a kind of fiction in itself. And then when she realizes, in a sense, what she's done, because she's lamenting losing something that was not actual, once she realizes that, it's possible for her to live again. I want to think about that frame by frame. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could speak more about thinking about all these different connections and meaning making. So Three Colors is part of a trilogy. So its relation to white and red.
Yeah.
And then how red brings all those films together by the end. And this mysterious coincidence, accident, miracle, whatever it might be. So I was wondering if you could reflect on that, maybe in light of this kind of pushback against the buffered self that Kieslowski is suggesting.
Yeah, there's a scene here where she goes to court, and the character from White is in court, and that's the White is very much a kind of parody of the relation between Poland and France, right? And he's saying, well, why should you penalize me if I can't speak good French? So that's the line that the character from White is using in this court case, where his wife is divorcing him and then destroying him. I don't know how much I want to give away of the end of Red. On the one hand, it certainly looks back at the previous two films and its main characters sort of make an appearance at the end of Red. And it looks like, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, because I almost feel like you need to watch that scene first, the end of Red, and then go back, because otherwise it looks like these particular characters that Kieslowski has been especially interested in are somehow especially blessed in some way. So I think if you start with those characters and then treat the previous two films and all of Red as the pre-story of the characters that you see at the end, it makes more sense. I almost wish that he had done a little prelude to Blue, which was the end of Red. Once you watch it, you'll see, because it looks kind of hokey, right? If you're watching it forward. But Red is the other. I think the three really, Double Life and then Blue and then Red. White's a kind of comedy, dark comedy, but The Red is an absolutely brilliant film. I think I might like it better than Blue, but it's a really beautiful film. And again, you have interestingly, the dislocated character there is not the female character, it's a male character. And I think the dislocation is more typical of the male characters. That's in a way what makes Julie's attempt to enact it, it makes it more startling in a way. And some of the things she does, like that, my friend Joe Kikasola, who's written a great book from Baylor on Kieslowski, he said every time he talks about Blue, people just want to talk about the scene with the knuckles along the cement, right? And that really captures where she is, where her soul is. Yeah.
So you just used the word blessed to describe the characters.
Yeah.
And if I remember right, you said his earlier series, the Decalogue,
Yeah.
is marked with characters that don't come to a sense of self. They go in circles.
Yeah.
This trilogy is the opposite.
Yeah, I actually think that's not entirely right about the Decalogue. We'd sort of have to go one by one.
So I guess for a question is that seems surprising, or maybe you can just comment on the role of the sacred versus the secular, where you have the religious series versus...
That relationship is porous in Kieslowski. I mean, that's where I worry the person who wrote in the New York Review of Books actually makes an argument that it's clear at the end of Blue that Kieslowski thinks that the future of the European Union is not secular liberalism, but Christianity. I don't know exactly what that means when he says that, right? And that's why I don't take the ending to be an answer to a political question. I think it's something not entirely separate because it's their social dimension, right? But I think it is more metaphysical and ethical, what he's reflecting on there. And actually, to follow up on your point, her participation in all of the liberties of Europe do not end up destroying her. They coexist with deeper resources that are also part of, in a sense, the liberalism of modern France. So I don't see it as that sharp a critique of, he's sort of reading what's happened and made Europe susceptible to fascism and populism and so forth, and trying to say this is, Kieslowski sort of suggesting that he saw this in advance, right? That if you go down this secular individualist path, you'll end up with all these horrible political problems, and that he was thinking I don't know what it would mean, a revival of Christianity. I'm just not sure what that means. But the sacred, I think I cut this when I was, Kieslowski is great at taking us as viewers to the cusp of the theological without ever actually explicitly affirming the theological. I mean, the overlapping of narratives, right? It's hard not to move up to the question of authorship and provenance, right? Because what on one level looks like mere chance, one of his first films, Blind Chance, is what it's called. No End is another film. It's very much toying with these ideas of dead ends in plots, chance in plots, but later the chance events seem to open up to a kind of connection and intelligibility and a mutual understanding across different lives, of the lives of others, that suggest a divinity that shapes our ends. But he takes us to the point where he's posing that question for us as viewers. But I do think that that you're naturally left to wonder about a kind of providence. that is bringing these stories together at some level. Is that just the filmmaker, or Kieslowski seems to be suggesting that he's mirroring something that we can apprehend in our own experience, and that the characters do too. I think there is a kind of sacredness of the everyday and the ordinary that isn't necessarily connected at all to revealed religion, right? The way in which his use of abstraction, that scene in the coffee shop where the music's playing and you suddenly get the isolated coffee cup with the sugar being placed in it, and it's beautiful and mesmerizing, and it fosters in us a sort of disposition to see and feel, but there is almost something sacramental about what the camera's doing there, right? There's a kind of sacredness to ordinary objects that Kieslowski wants us to some sense recover without affirming anything specific about revealed religion. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Well, just to kind of underline your point about randomness versus providence, this whole film seems to turn on a simple leak in a brake line.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
We're a little over time. Let's thank our speaker. Please stick around.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it.
Chat and ask questions. I'd like to meet the seminar participants down in front for a moment before we